The winter wind howled across the Ohio River Valley on February 1st, 1896, carrying with it the promise of snow and something far more sinister. Just after dawn, two farm workers made their way along the desolate country road near Fort Thomas, Kentucky, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air. What they discovered in that frozen field would become one of the most shocking and perplexing murder cases in American history. Lying face down in the tall, frost-covered grass was the body of a young woman. Her dark dress was torn and blood-stained, her delicate hands clutching at the earth as if she had fought desperately for life. But it was what wasn't there that would send shockwaves through Cincinnati, Louisville, and beyond. The woman's head had been severed completely from her body, removed with such precision that investigators would later marvel at the surgical skill required. The workers stumbled backward in horror, their minds struggling to process the gruesome scene before them. One ran for the nearest telephone, his hands shaking as he cranked the handle to reach the Campbell County Sheriff's Office. Within an hour, the quiet countryside was swarming with lawmen, newspaper reporters, and morbid curiosity seekers, all drawn to witness what the Cincinnati Enquirer would call the most fiendish crime ever committed in the Ohio Valley. Sheriff Jewel Plummer knelt beside the headless corpse, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. The woman was young, perhaps 20 years old, with a slender build and soft hands that suggested she'd never known hard labor. Her clothing, though blood-soaked and torn, was of good quality. This was no common streetwalker or vagrant. The precision of the decapitation troubled him most. This wasn't the work of a frenzied killer or a random act of violence. Someone with anatomical knowledge had done this terrible deed. Dr. George Carruthers, the county coroner, arrived as the first snowflakes began to fall. His examination revealed that the woman had been pregnant, approximately 4 months along. The cause of death appeared to be cocaine poisoning, administered in massive doses before the decapitation occurred. But why remove the head? Why go to such elaborate lengths to conceal the victim's identity? These questions would consume investigators for months to come. As word of the discovery spread, telegraph wires hummed with urgent messages between law enforcement agencies across Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana. Missing person reports flooded in from desperate families. But without the head, identification seemed impossible. The body was carefully transported to the Campbell County morgue, where it would become the center of one of the era's most intensive investigations. The press dubbed her the Headless Mystery, and within days, the story had captured national attention. Newspaper headlines screamed of surgical precision and calculated brutality. The case had everything the public craved: mystery, horror, and the tantalizing possibility that the killer might be someone respectable, someone trusted, someone who walked among decent society wearing a mask of respectability. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. But this was more than just another sensational murder case. The discovery near Fort Thomas would mark the beginning of a forensic revolution, introducing revolutionary investigative techniques that would change criminal detection forever. Little did anyone know that the key to solving this seemingly impossible case lay not in what was found, but in what was missing, and in the cutting-edge science of dental identification that was about to make its American debut. The headless woman in the Kentucky field had a name, a family, and a tragic story that would soon unfold. Her death would expose a web of deception, betrayal, and calculated evil that stretched across state lines and into the most respectable corners of society. Before it was over, 2 men would hang, forensic science would take a giant leap forward, and the name Pearl Bryan would be forever etched into criminal history. 200 miles northeast of that frozen Kentucky field, in the quiet college town of Greencastle, Indiana, the Bryan family was growing increasingly worried. Their daughter Pearl had been missing for over a week, and her absence hung over the modest household like a dark cloud that refused to lift. Pearl Josephine Bryan had been the pride of her family, a bright, vivacious young woman of 22 with sparkling eyes and an infectious laugh that could light up any room. Born into a respectable farming family on May 1st, 1873, Pearl had grown up surrounded by the rolling hills and fertile farmland of Putnam County. Her father, Alexander Bryan, worked hard to provide for his family, while her mother, Susan, maintained their home with the quiet dignity of a woman who understood both hardship and hope. Unlike many rural girls of her generation, Pearl had received a solid education. She was intelligent, well-read, and possessed a natural charm that drew people to her. Those who knew her described a young woman with dreams that extended far beyond the boundaries of small-town Indiana. She spoke often of traveling, of seeing the great cities she'd read about in books and magazines. Cincinnati, just a day's journey south, seemed to her a gateway to a larger, more exciting world. But Pearl Bryan harbored a secret that would have scandalized Greencastle society if it had been known. For months, she had been carrying on a clandestine correspondence with a young man named Scott Jackson, a dental student at the Ohio College of Dental Surgery in Cincinnati. Their relationship had progressed far beyond mere letters, and by the winter of 1896, Pearl found herself facing the most terrifying prospect an unmarried woman of her era could imagine. She was pregnant. In the rigid moral climate of the 1890s, an unwed pregnancy was a catastrophe that could destroy not just a woman's reputation, but her entire family's standing in the community. Pearl had confided in only one person, her cousin William Wood, who worked in Cincinnati and had promised to help her navigate this impossible situation. Wood had arranged for Pearl to travel to the city under the pretense of visiting him and his wife, but the real purpose was far more desperate. On January 27, 1896, Pearl had kissed her parents goodbye and boarded the train for Cincinnati, her heart heavy with fear and uncertainty. She carried with her a small satchel containing her best dress, a few personal belongings, and a letter from Scott Jackson promising to take care of everything. Her family believed she was going for a pleasant visit that would last perhaps a week. They had no idea they would never see their daughter alive again. The journey to Cincinnati should have taken less than a day, but Pearl's trip had been carefully orchestrated by Scott Jackson. He had instructed her to stop first in Indianapolis, where she would meet Alonzo Walling, Jackson's roommate and closest friend. Walling, a soft-spoken young man with kind eyes, had been tasked with escorting Pearl to Cincinnati and ensuring she arrived safely at Jackson's apartment. But something had gone terribly wrong. William Wood had waited anxiously at the Cincinnati train station on January 28th, scanning every passenger who disembarked. Pearl never appeared. His telegrams to the Bryan family in Greencastle grew increasingly frantic as the days passed. Had she missed her connection? Had she fallen ill along the way? The possibilities tormented him, but none prepared him for the horrible truth that was about to be revealed. As Sheriff Plummer's investigation into the Headless corpse intensified, missing person reports from across the region were being carefully cataloged and compared. Pearl Bryan's description, provided by her desperate family, would soon catch the attention of investigators. The height matched, 5 feet 4 inches. The build was consistent, slender, and petite. Most importantly, the timeline aligned perfectly with the estimated time of death. But it was Pearl's distinctive clothing that would provide the first real break in the case. Her mother, Susan Bryan, had lovingly described every detail of the outfit her daughter had worn when she left Greencastle. A dark blue dress with distinctive buttons, a particular style of corset, and shoes that had been specially ordered from an Indianapolis catalog. When these details were compared with the clothing found on the Headless corpse, the similarities were undeniable. The girl from Greencastle, with her dreams of adventure and her tragic secret, had met her end in a frozen Kentucky field. But her story was far from over. The investigation that would follow would expose a network of deception and betrayal that reached into the most respected circles of Cincinnati society, revealing how easily a young woman's trust could be exploited by those who viewed her not as a human being, but as a problem to be eliminated. Dr. Edward H. Score had never imagined that his expertise in dental identification would thrust him into the center of America's most sensational murder case. As one of Cincinnati's most respected dentists and a pioneer in the emerging field of forensic odontology, Dr. Score understood better than most that teeth were as unique as fingerprints and far more durable than flesh. When Sheriff Plummer contacted him on February 5, 1896, the request was unprecedented. Could dental records be used to identify a headless corpse? The very question seemed like something from a penny dreadful novel. But Dr. Score knew that modern science was about to be put to its most crucial test. The breakthrough came when investigators learned that Pearl Bryan had received extensive dental work during her lifetime. Her family dentist in Greencastle, Dr. R.A. Harris, had maintained meticulous records of every procedure performed on Pearl's teeth. More importantly, Pearl had received several distinctive gold fillings that would be impossible to replicate exactly. Dental work that could serve as an infallible form of identification if only they could examine the victim's teeth. But there was one terrifying problem. The head was missing. Dr. Scores studied the gruesome photographs from the crime scene with the methodical precision of a scientist and the growing horror of a human being. The decapitation had been performed with surgical skill, the cut made precisely between the 6th and 7th cervical vertebrae. Whoever had done this possessed intimate knowledge of human anatomy, knowledge that could only come from medical or dental training. This realization sent chills through the investigation team. They weren't hunting a common criminal or a deranged madman. The killer was educated, skilled, and had access to surgical instruments. The suspect pool had suddenly narrowed to include doctors, medical students, and others with anatomical expertise. The search for Pearl's head became the most intensive manhunt in Ohio Valley history. Hundreds of volunteers combed through fields, forests, and abandoned buildings across 3 states. Rivers were dragged, wells were searched, and garbage dumps were methodically excavated. The Cincinnati Police Department offered a substantial reward for information leading to the discovery of the missing head, while newspaper reporters offered even larger sums for exclusive access to the gruesome evidence. Meanwhile, Dr. Score was developing a revolutionary approach to the identification problem. If they couldn't find the head, perhaps they could work backward from the dental records. He began corresponding with dentists across the region, gathering detailed descriptions of any distinctive dental work that might match their victim. The process was painstaking and unprecedented, but it represented the cutting edge of forensic science. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Harris in Greencastle had not only kept detailed written records of Pearl's dental work, but he had also created a plaster cast of her teeth, a relatively new practice that he used to track the progress of complex procedures. When this cast was compared to the measurements and descriptions provided by Pearl's family, the match was undeniable. But the most compelling evidence came from Pearl's clothing and personal effects. Hidden in the lining of her corset, investigators discovered something that would crack the case wide open: a railway ticket stub from Indianapolis to Cincinnati, dated January 28, 1896. More importantly, they found a small piece of paper with an address written in Pearl's distinctive handwriting, an address that led directly to a boarding house in Cincinnati's medical district. The address belonged to the residence of Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling. Dr. Score's methodical approach to the dental evidence had done more than identify Pearl Bryan. It had introduced American law enforcement to the power of forensic science. His detailed analysis of the decapitation wound would later prove crucial in establishing the killer's medical knowledge, while his innovative use of dental records would become a standard practice in criminal investigations across the country. What's your take on this case? The precision of the crime suggested someone with intimate knowledge of human anatomy, yet the brutality seemed to contradict the careful, scientific approach. Was this the work of a cold, calculating killer, or had something gone terribly wrong with what was supposed to be a different kind of crime entirely? As the investigation closed in on the boarding house in Cincinnati's medical district, one thing became clear. Pearl Bryan's murder was not a random act of violence, but a carefully planned elimination of a young woman whose pregnancy had become inconvenient for someone with everything to lose. The dental evidence had not only identified the victim, it had pointed investigators toward a suspect whose respectable facade was about to be stripped away, revealing the monster beneath. The Headless mystery was about to become very personal indeed. Scott Jackson cut an impressive figure as he walked through the halls of the Ohio College of Dental Surgery. At 24, he possessed the kind of easy charm and confident bearing that drew both admiration and envy from his fellow students. Tall and well-built, with penetrating dark eyes and a carefully groomed mustache, Jackson embodied everything a young professional should be in the 1890s: ambitious, intelligent, and socially adept. But beneath his polished exterior lurked a predator of extraordinary cunning. Jackson had arrived in Cincinnati from New Jersey with impeccable credentials, and seemingly unlimited potential. His academic performance was exemplary, his surgical skills were already being praised by professors, and his bedside manner with patients was noted for its reassuring confidence. To his instructors, he appeared destined for a successful practice in one of Cincinnati's finer neighborhoods. To his classmates, he was the kind of man who made success look effortless. To the young women who caught his attention, he was utterly irresistible. Jackson had perfected the art of seduction with the same methodical precision he applied to his dental studies. He understood that women of the era craved romance, adventure, and escape from the suffocating constraints of Victorian society. He presented himself as their gateway to a larger world, educated, sophisticated, and tantalizingly dangerous. His letters to Pearl Bryan, discovered later by investigators, revealed a master manipulator who knew exactly which emotional strings to pull. "My dearest Pearl," one letter began, "you cannot imagine how your sweet words brighten even the darkest days of my studies. When I think of our future together, of the life we could build beyond the narrow confines of small-town prejudice, I am filled with such hope and longing. You are too precious, too intelligent, too alive to waste away in Greencastle when the world holds so many wonders for a woman of your caliber." These weren't the clumsy romantic overtures of a lovesick young man. They were the calculated manipulations of someone who viewed other human beings as objects to be used and discarded. Jackson had learned early that women would do almost anything for a man who made them feel special, chosen, superior to their mundane surroundings. Pearl Bryan was not his first victim. Investigators would later discover that Jackson had maintained simultaneous romantic correspondences with at least 6 different women across 3 states. Each believed herself to be his one true love, his secret fiancée, his escape from an otherwise lonely existence. He had convinced a factory girl in Newark that he would marry her as soon as he completed his studies. He had promised a minister's daughter in Louisville that their love would scandalize the world with its intensity. He had sworn to a wealthy widow in Lexington that her financial support of his education would be repaid with a lifetime of devotion. But Pearl Bryan represented something different, a more dangerous complication that threatened to destroy his carefully constructed facade. When Pearl's letters began to hint at her condition, Jackson's correspondence took on a noticeably different tone. Gone were the flowery declarations of eternal love, replaced by practical discussions of solutions and arrangements. He wrote of knowing people who could help with her situation and promised that everything would be taken care of quietly and professionally. Pearl, desperate and frightened, clung to his assurances that he would protect her reputation and her future. Jackson's roommate, Alonzo Walling, watched his friend's growing agitation with increasing concern. Walling was everything Jackson pretended to be, genuinely kind, honorable, and decent. The son of a respected Kentucky family, he had come to Cincinnati with dreams of becoming a teacher, supporting himself by working odd jobs while taking night classes. His friendship with Jackson had begun innocently enough, but gradually he found himself drawn deeper into his roommate's web of deception and manipulation. Jackson had a remarkable talent for making others complicit in his schemes without their fully understanding what they were agreeing to. He convinced Walling that Pearl Bryan was a difficult situation that required delicate handling. He spoke of her as a problem that could destroy both their futures if not managed properly. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, he drew his roommate into a conspiracy that would ultimately cost them both their lives. The fatal plan began to take shape in mid-January 1896. Jackson had convinced Pearl to come to Cincinnati under the pretense of arranging for her condition to be quietly resolved. He told her that he knew a doctor who could help her, that everything would be handled discreetly, and that afterward they could begin planning their life together. What he actually intended was something far more sinister. Jackson had access to cocaine through his dental studies. The drug was commonly used as a local anesthetic in dental procedures. He knew its properties intimately. In large doses, it could cause heart failure, respiratory collapse, and death. More importantly for his purposes, it would be difficult to detect in a post-mortem examination using the forensic techniques available in 1896. As Pearl's train approached Cincinnati on that cold January evening, Scott Jackson was putting the finishing touches on a plan that he believed would eliminate his problem permanently while preserving his reputation and his future. He had no way of knowing that his perfect crime would instead become one of the most thoroughly documented and intensively investigated murders in American history. The dental student who thought he understood everything about anatomy was about to learn that some secrets refused to stay buried. In the shadow of Scott Jackson's magnetic personality stood Alonzo Walling, a young man whose tragic flaw was not malice, but loyalty. At 23, Walling possessed the quiet dignity and moral foundation that Jackson so expertly mimicked. The son of a prominent Kentucky family, he had been raised with values that emphasized honor, integrity, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. These very virtues would prove to be his undoing. Walling's path to Cincinnati had been markedly different from his roommate's calculated journey. Financial hardship had forced him to abandon his dreams of attending university full-time, but he remained determined to better himself through education. He worked long hours at a local factory during the day, then attended night classes at a business college, slowly building toward a career in teaching or bookkeeping. His letters home revealed a young man of simple ambitions and genuine faith, someone who still believed that hard work and moral character would ultimately be rewarded. The friendship between Jackson and Walling seemed, on the surface, unlikely. Where Jackson was outgoing and socially adept, Walling was reserved and thoughtful. Where Jackson charmed his way through difficulties, Walling faced them with quiet determination. Yet Jackson had recognized in his roommate exactly what he needed, someone decent enough to provide credibility, loyal enough to be manipulated, and naive enough to be deceived. Jackson's seduction of Walling's conscience was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. He never asked his roommate to do anything that seemed obviously wrong. Instead, he presented each request as a favor between friends, a small compromise made in service of a greater good. When he needed Walling to escort Pearl Bryan from Indianapolis to Cincinnati, he framed it as protecting a vulnerable young woman who needed safe passage to the city. When he asked Walling to help him obtain cocaine from the dental college supplies, he claimed it was for legitimate medical research. "Alonzo," Jackson had said, placing a brotherly hand on his roommate's shoulder, "I wouldn't ask if it weren't important. This girl is in trouble, and she trusts me to help her. Sometimes a gentleman must bend the rules slightly to protect a lady's reputation." These conversations always took place late at night, when Walling was exhausted from his factory job and his evening studies. Jackson understood that tired people were more susceptible to persuasion, that moral resistance crumbled when the mind was weary. He chose his moments carefully, always presenting himself as the worldly mentor guiding his innocent friend through the complexities of adult life. Walling's journal, discovered after his arrest, revealed the internal struggle that consumed him during those final weeks of January 1896. He wrote of feeling increasingly uncomfortable with Jackson's requests, yet unable to pinpoint exactly what troubled him. He sensed that his roommate was involved in something unsavory, but Jackson's explanations always sounded reasonable when presented with his characteristic confidence and charm. "I find myself questioning Scott's judgments more frequently," one entry read. "He speaks of this Cincinnati girl as if she were merely an inconvenience to be managed rather than a human being deserving of compassion. Yet he insists that helping her requires methods that seem to compromise everything I was taught to believe about proper conduct. I pray that my suspicions are unfounded." The fatal evening of January 31st found Walling in a state of profound moral conflict. Jackson had finally revealed the true nature of his plan. Pearl Bryan would be given what he described as a medical treatment that would solve her problem permanently. He assured Walling that the procedure was simple, painless, and widely practiced in sophisticated cities like Cincinnati. All Walling needed to do was help transport Pearl to the location where the treatment would take place. Walling's resistance was beginning to crumble under the weight of Jackson's relentless persuasion and his own exhaustion. Jackson painted a picture of Pearl as a woman whose reputation and future hung in the balance, whose only hope lay in their discretion and assistance. He spoke of the broader principles at stake: protecting innocent people from the harsh judgments of a hypocritical society, standing by friends in their hour of need, proving oneself worthy of trust and confidence. "Think of your own sister, Alonzo," Jackson had said, knowing that Walling's protective instincts toward family were among his strongest motivations. "Wouldn't you want someone to help her if she found herself in such circumstances?" Sometimes the most moral action appears immoral to those who lack the courage to see beyond conventional prejudices. What Alonzo Walling didn't realize was that Jackson's medical treatment was nothing more than murder disguised in clinical language. The cocaine that Jackson had obtained wasn't intended to alleviate Pearl's condition. It was meant to kill her. The procedure wouldn't take place in a medical facility, but in an abandoned area across the river in Kentucky, where her body could be disposed of with less risk of immediate discovery. On the night that Pearl Bryan died, Alonzo Walling discovered the true cost of misplaced loyalty. Standing in that frozen Kentucky field, watching Jackson methodically dismember the young woman they had just murdered, Walling finally understood the magnitude of his moral compromise. But by then, it was far too late for redemption. His journal's final entry, written hours before his arrest, captured the complete destruction of a once decent young man. I have become something I no longer recognize. In trying to prove my friendship, I have lost my soul. The accomplice who had sought only to help a friend had instead helped create one of the most heinous crimes in American history. The boarding house at 222 West 9th Street stood in the heart of Cincinnati's bustling medical district, a three-story brick building that housed the dreams and ambitions of young men pursuing careers in medicine and dentistry. Mrs. Sarah Hawkins, the landlady, prided herself on maintaining a respectable establishment where serious students could focus on their studies without the distractions that plagued less well-managed accommodations. She had no idea that her house had become the headquarters for one of the most carefully orchestrated murders in American criminal history. Detective Cal Krim of the Cincinnati Police Department climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor on February 9, 1896, armed with a search warrant and a growing certainty that he was about to uncover something extraordinary. The railway ticket found in Pearl Bryan's corset had led him here, to room 7, where Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling had lived as model tenants for nearly 6 months. The room itself was spartanly furnished but meticulously organized. Jackson's side displayed the trappings of a serious student: medical textbooks, anatomical charts, and an impressive collection of surgical instruments that he claimed were necessary for his dental studies. Walling's area was more modest, containing mainly business texts and correspondence from his family in Kentucky. But it was what Detective Krim found hidden beneath Jackson's mattress that transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a murder inquiry that would capture national attention. The letters were damning beyond imagination. Pearl Bryan's correspondence with Jackson revealed a relationship that had progressed from innocent romance to desperate manipulation over the course of 8 months. The early letters were filled with the breathless excitement of a young woman experiencing her first serious romance. Pearl wrote of her dreams of escaping small-town life, of the excitement she felt when receiving his letters, of her growing certainty that he was her destiny. But as the relationship progressed, the tone shifted dramatically. Pearl's later letters revealed growing anxiety about her condition and increasing dependence on Jackson's promises to handle everything. She wrote of sleepless nights spent worrying about discovery, of the terror she felt at the thought of her parents learning her secret, of her absolute faith that Jackson would protect her from scandal and ruin. "My dearest Scott," one particularly heartbreaking letter read, "I find myself unable to eat or sleep. So consumed am I with worry about our situation. You promised that you knew people who could help, that everything could be managed quietly and professionally. I trust you completely, but time is growing short, and I fear that delay will make our problem more difficult to solve. Please, I beg you, arrange for me to come to Cincinnati as soon as possible." Jackson's responses, written in his careful, educated hand, were masterpieces of calculated deception. He portrayed himself as a man wrestling with complex logistical challenges, someone working tirelessly behind the scenes to arrange for Pearl's treatment while protecting both their reputations. He wrote of needing to coordinate with specialists who required careful scheduling, of the necessity of maintaining absolute secrecy to protect Pearl's future prospects. But Detective Krim found something even more incriminating than the correspondence: detailed notes in Jackson's handwriting that outlined what could only be described as a murder plot. Hidden in a hollowed-out medical textbook were pages of calculations involving cocaine dosages, anatomical diagrams showing the precise location of major blood vessels in the neck, and what appeared to be a timeline for disposing of evidence. The most chilling discovery was a hand-drawn map showing the route from Cincinnati to the isolated area near Fort Thomas where Pearl's body had been found. Jackson had scouted the location in advance, noting the distance from the nearest road, the likelihood of discovery, and the best methods for accessing the site without being observed. This wasn't a crime of passion or a plan gone wrong. It was a carefully orchestrated execution. Mrs. Hawkins, when questioned by Detective Krim, provided crucial testimony about her tenant's behavior during the week of Pearl's murder. She had noticed Jackson's unusual nervousness, his frequent absences at odd hours, and his insistence on doing his own laundry, highly unusual for a young man who typically relied on the boarding house's washing services. She also remembered Walling's obvious distress during the same period, his loss of appetite, and his uncharacteristic silence during the communal dinners that were a fixture of boarding house life. The investigation revealed that Jackson had been planning Pearl's murder for weeks before she arrived in Cincinnati. He had used his access to the dental college to obtain not only cocaine, but also the surgical instruments necessary for the decapitation. He had convinced Walling to rent a horse and buggy under false pretenses, claiming they needed transportation for a medical emergency that required discretion. Most damning of all, witnesses came forward who had seen Jackson and Walling transporting what appeared to be a heavy bundle across the Ohio River on the night of February 1st. A ferry operator remembered the two young men because of their nervous behavior and their insistence on paying extra to ensure that no other passengers would share their late-night crossing. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. The Cincinnati connection had been thoroughly exposed, revealing a network of deception that stretched from the respectable boarding houses of the medical district to the darkest corners of human nature. Jackson's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and with each piece of evidence uncovered, the true scope of his manipulation and malice became clearer. The young dental student who had seemed so promising, so full of potential, was revealed to be a calculating killer who had viewed Pearl Bryan not as a human being deserving of compassion, but as an obstacle to be eliminated with the same clinical precision he brought to his studies. The hunt for Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling was about to begin. The courthouse in Newport, Kentucky, had never seen anything like it. By March 1896, the trial of Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling had transformed the quiet river town into a circus of sensational journalism, legal maneuvering, and public fascination that stretched across the entire nation. Reporters from as far away as New York and Chicago descended upon Campbell County, their telegraph keys chattering constantly as they fed America's insatiable appetite for every gruesome detail of what newspapers were calling the crime of the century. Judge John W. Helm presided over the proceedings with the stern dignity of a man who understood that history was watching. The courtroom, packed beyond capacity each day, represented a cross-section of American society. Wealthy socialites sat beside factory workers, ministers shared benches with saloon keepers, and proper ladies rubbed shoulders with women of questionable reputation, all united in their morbid fascination with the headless mystery that had captivated the nation. Commonwealth Attorney William Hendricks understood that he was prosecuting more than just a murder case. He was putting on trial the very notion that educated, respectable men could be capable of unspeakable evil. His opening statement painted Jackson and Walling not as the refined gentlemen they appeared to be, but as calculating predators who had used their social standing and educational advantages to lure an innocent young woman to her death. "Gentlemen of the jury," Hendricks began, his voice carrying across the hushed courtroom, "the defense would have you believe that we are dealing with a tragedy born of circumstance, an unfortunate accident that spiraled beyond the control of two otherwise decent young men. I submit to you that nothing could be further from the truth. The evidence will show that Pearl Bryan was murdered with the cold, calculated precision of a medical procedure, her body mutilated with the skill of a trained surgeon, and her identity concealed with the thoroughness of professional criminals." The prosecution's case was built upon a foundation of scientific evidence that was revolutionary for its time. Dr. Edward Score's testimony about dental identification techniques captivated the courtroom, as he explained how Pearl Bryan's unique dental work had allowed investigators to identify her remains with absolute certainty. His detailed analysis of the decapitation wound provided compelling evidence of the killer's anatomical knowledge, supporting the prosecution's theory that Jackson's medical training had made the perfect crime possible. But it was the testimony of Detective Krim that truly devastated the defense. Reading from Jackson's own notes, the detective revealed the meticulous planning that had gone into Pearl's murder. The jury listened in stunned silence as Krim described the cocaine calculations, the anatomical diagrams, and the carefully drawn map that had led investigators to the crime scene. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a coldly calculated execution. Jackson's defense attorney, Colonel Charles Crabb, faced a nearly impossible task. The evidence against his client was overwhelming, the public sentiment was violently hostile, and Jackson's own arrogance had alienated potential sympathizers. Crabb's strategy focused on portraying Jackson as a young man who had made terrible mistakes but who didn't deserve to die for them. He emphasized Jackson's youth, his previously unblemished record, and his promising future that would be cut short by the hangman's noose. Walling's defense proved even more challenging. Attorney William Kincaid argued that his client was essentially an innocent dupe, manipulated by the more sophisticated and worldly Jackson into participating in a crime he never fully understood. Kincaid presented Walling as a victim of Jackson's manipulation, a decent young man whose only crime was trusting the wrong friend. The prosecution countered with witnesses who testified to Walling's active participation in the murder plot. The ferry operator who had transported them across the Ohio River described Walling's nervous behavior and his obvious awareness that something illegal was taking place. Mrs. Hawkins testified about Walling's distressed condition in the days following Pearl's disappearance, suggesting a guilty conscience rather than innocent confusion. But perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial came when Pearl Bryan's mother, Susan, took the witness stand. Her quiet dignity and obvious grief provided a stark contrast to the clinical discussions of evidence and procedure that had dominated the proceedings. When she described her daughter's hopes and dreams, her plans for the future, and her trust in the young man who had promised to protect her, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Pearl was not the kind of girl who would go willingly with strangers, Mrs. Bryan testified, her voice barely above a whisper. She trusted Scott Jackson because he had convinced her that he loved her, that he would marry her, that he would protect her from scandal and shame. She went to Cincinnati believing that she was going to begin a new life. Instead, she found only death. The defense's attempts to paint Pearl as a willing participant in her own destruction fell flat in the face of Mrs. Bryan's testimony. The letters that Jackson had written, filled with promises of love and protection, made clear that Pearl had been the victim of an elaborate deception rather than a willing participant in any criminal activity. As the trial progressed, the fundamental question became not whether Jackson and Walling were guilty. The evidence was too overwhelming to dispute, but whether they deserved to hang for their crimes. The prosecution argued that the calculated nature of the murder, combined with the defendant's attempts to conceal Pearl's identity, demonstrated a level of premeditation that demanded the ultimate penalty. The defense's final arguments focused on mercy, on the waste of promising young lives, and on the possibility of redemption. But their pleas fell on deaf ears. The jury, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, returned with verdicts that surprised no one. Guilty of murder in the first degree for both defendants, with recommendations for the death penalty. Judge Helms' sentencing was swift and uncompromising. Both men would hang for their crimes, their executions scheduled for the maximum time allowed under Kentucky law. As the verdicts were read, Jackson maintained his facade of innocence, shaking his head and proclaiming his martyrdom. Walling simply wept, finally understanding the full weight of his misplaced loyalty. The verdict had been delivered, the death sentences pronounced, but one crucial piece of evidence remained tantalizingly out of reach. Pearl Bryan's head, the key to fully understanding the crime and perhaps uncovering additional secrets, had seemingly vanished into thin air. What began as a standard evidence recovery effort would evolve into one of the most extensive and bizarre searches in American criminal history, consuming thousands of man-hours and spawning legends that would persist for decades. Sheriff Jewel Plummer had initially believed the head would be discovered within days of finding the body. After all, how far could two young men transport such gruesome evidence? The logical assumption was that Jackson and Walling had simply thrown it into the Ohio River, where it would eventually surface or be caught in fishing nets. But as days turned to weeks and weeks to months, it became clear that the disposal had been far more carefully planned than anyone had imagined. The search expanded systematically across 3 states, driven by both law enforcement determination and increasingly substantial reward money. The Campbell County authorities offered $500 for the recovery of the head, a fortune equivalent to several years' wages for most working men. Newspapers across the region added their own bounties, and private citizens contributed to reward funds that eventually totaled over $2,000. The financial incentive transformed the Ohio River Valley into a landscape of amateur investigators. Farmers abandoned their spring planting to search wooded areas and abandoned buildings. Factory workers spent their weekends dragging ponds and exploring caves. Even respectable businessmen could be seen poking through garbage dumps and examining every suspicious object that might yield the missing evidence. The search efforts revealed the extraordinary lengths to which Jackson and Walling had gone to conceal their crime. Investigators discovered that Jackson had made several mysterious trips across the river in the weeks following Pearl's murder, always traveling alone and always carrying packages whose contents he refused to explain to curious observers. One witness reported seeing him near an old limestone quarry 15 miles south of Cincinnati, while another claimed to have spotted him burying something in a remote cemetery outside Covington. Dr. Edward Score, whose dental expertise had already proven crucial to the case, became the unofficial coordinator of the head recovery efforts. His scientific approach to the search stood in stark contrast to the amateur treasure hunting that characterized most civilian efforts. Dr. Score organized systematic searches of specific locations based on evidence and logical deduction rather than wishful thinking and rumor. The perpetrators of this crime demonstrated considerable anatomical knowledge, Dr. Score explained to a gathering of law enforcement officials. They would have understood that proper disposal required more than simply discarding the evidence in the nearest convenient location. Jackson, in particular, would have known that decomposition rates vary dramatically depending on environmental conditions. We must think like scientists, not like treasure hunters. The most promising lead came from an unexpected source, Jackson's own correspondence. Hidden among his personal effects, investigators found a cryptic letter to a medical colleague in which he discussed theoretical methods for disposing of anatomical specimens. The letter, written months before Pearl's murder, contained detailed discussions of chemical decomposition, the effects of lime on organic matter, and the relative merits of burial versus water disposal. This correspondence led investigators to focus their attention on the medical college itself. Jackson had access to the school's laboratory facilities, including chemical supplies that could rapidly decompose organic matter. More importantly, the college maintained an incinerator for disposing of anatomical specimens that were no longer needed for study. Could Jackson have used the very institution where he studied to dispose of his victims' remains? The search of the dental college yielded disturbing evidence, but not the smoking gun investigators hoped to find. Chemical analysis of the incinerator revealed traces of human tissue that couldn't be accounted for by routine laboratory disposal. Janitors reported that Jackson had frequently worked late into the night during the period following Pearl's disappearance, often requesting access to facilities that were normally locked after hours. But the most chilling discovery came from the college's anatomical specimen storage area. Several jars containing preserved human organs showed signs of recent tampering, and one large container that should have held a complete human brain was conspicuously empty. The implications were horrifying. Had Jackson used Pearl's murder as an opportunity to practice his surgical skills, treating her remains as nothing more than laboratory specimens? As the search intensified, Jackson and Walling, awaiting execution in the Campbell County Jail, became the focus of increasingly desperate interrogation efforts. Prosecutors offered reduced sentences, improved jail conditions, and even religious counsel in exchange for information about the head's location. Both men maintained their innocence while simultaneously providing contradictory hints about where the missing evidence might be found. Jackson's behavior during these interrogations revealed the depths of his narcissism and manipulation. He seemed to relish the attention, offering cryptic clues that sent search teams on wild goose chases across the tri-state area. He spoke of scientific principles that governed evidence disposal and hinted at knowledge that would revolutionize forensic investigation if he chose to share it. Walling's responses were markedly different, revealing a man consumed by guilt and desperate for redemption. He provided more specific information about their activities on the night of the murder, but insisted that Jackson had handled the final disposal alone. His descriptions of Jackson's behavior during and after the crime painted a picture of a man who had planned every detail with scientific precision. The search for pearls had ultimately consumed over 18 months and cost tens of thousands of dollars in public and private funds. Teams of investigators combed through hundreds of locations based on tips, confessions, and scientific analysis. Wells were drained, buildings were demolished, and entire hillsides were excavated in the desperate hope of finding the missing evidence. Yet Pearl Bryan's head was never recovered. The failure to locate this crucial piece of evidence would haunt the case for generations, spawning countless theories and amateur investigations. Some believed Jackson had fed it to animals, others that he had dissolved it in acid at the medical college. The most persistent theory suggested that he had hidden it so cleverly that it would never be found, taking the secret to his grave as his final act of defiance against a society that had condemned him. What's your take on this case? The missing head represented more than just evidence. It symbolized the killer's ultimate victory over justice, his ability to keep one final secret even as he faced the hangman's noose. The double execution scheduled for March 20th, 1897, had transformed the quiet town of Newport, Kentucky, into a macabre carnival that would haunt the community for generations. By dawn, nearly 10,000 spectators had gathered around the Campbell County Jail, their faces reflecting a mixture of morbid curiosity, righteous satisfaction, and barely concealed bloodlust that revealed the darker angels of human nature. Sheriff Jewel Plummer had spent sleepless nights preparing for what would be the most public execution in Kentucky history. The unprecedented media attention meant that every detail would be scrutinized, every procedure examined for evidence of either justice served or barbarism disguised as law. 2 scaffolds had been constructed in the jail yard, designed to allow both men to be executed simultaneously. A grim efficiency that reflected the community's desire to close this horrible chapter as quickly as possible. Scott Jackson spent his final night in a state of remarkable composure that unnerved even his most hardened guards. He had maintained his innocence throughout the appeals process, crafting increasingly elaborate theories about the real killers who had framed him for Pearl Bryan's murder. His letters to newspapers, written in the elegant hand that had once charmed unsuspecting young women, portrayed him as a martyr to judicial incompetence and public hysteria. "I go to my death an innocent man," Jackson wrote in his final statement, released to the press hours before his execution. "History will vindicate me, and those responsible for this miscarriage of justice will someday answer to a higher court than any assembled by mortal men. I forgive my persecutors, for they know not what they do." The arrogance embedded in these words was breathtaking. Even facing death, Jackson could not resist positioning himself as superior to those around him, intellectually and morally above the society that had condemned him. His religious conversion, announced with great fanfare during his final weeks, struck observers as calculated theater rather than genuine spiritual awakening. Alonzo Walling presented a stark contrast to his former roommate's defiant posturing. The months in jail had transformed him from a robust young man into a gaunt, hollow-eyed wreck consumed by guilt and terror. His genuine remorse was evident to everyone who encountered him, from the hardened jailers to the ministers who sought to provide spiritual comfort during his final days. Walling's confession, delivered to Reverend H. Kavanaugh just hours before his execution, provided the most detailed account of Pearl Bryan's final moments that investigators would ever receive. His words, transcribed by a stenographer and later published in newspapers across the nation, painted a horrifying picture of premeditated murder disguised as medical assistance. Scott told Pearl that he was taking her to see a doctor who would help with her condition, Walling whispered, his voice barely audible in the cramped jail cell. She trusted him completely, never suspecting that he had already decided she had to die. When we reached the place across the river, Scott gave her what he said was medicine to calm her nerves. It was cocaine, enough cocaine to kill a horse. The confession revealed that Pearl had remained conscious for several terrifying minutes after ingesting the fatal dose, long enough to realize that something was terribly wrong. She had begged Jackson to help her, to take her to a real doctor, to save her life and the life of her unborn child. Jackson had responded with clinical detachment, monitoring her vital signs like a scientist observing an experiment rather than a man watching his lover die. She kept asking why. Walling continued, tears streaming down his face. She couldn't understand why Scott was letting her suffer, why he wouldn't help her. I wanted to run for help, but Scott said it was too late, that she was already dying, that all we could do was make sure she didn't suffer unnecessarily. The decapitation had occurred after Pearl's death, performed with surgical instruments that Jackson had stolen from the dental college. Walling's description of the procedure was so clinically precise that investigators finally understood the true extent of Jackson's anatomical knowledge and the calculating nature of his crime planning. Scott said we had to remove the head to prevent identification. Walling confessed. He claimed that without dental records, the body could never be positively identified. He performed the surgery like he was working on a cadaver in the medical college. There was no emotion, no recognition that this had once been a human being he claimed to love. As the execution hour approached, the contrast between the two condemned men became even more pronounced. Jackson spent his final morning writing letters, granting interviews to reporters, and posing for photographs that would later appear in newspapers across the country. He seemed energized by the attention, treating his execution as the final performance in a drama that had made him famous. Walling, by contrast, could barely function. He had to be supported by guards as he walked to the scaffold, his legs trembling with terror and remorse. His final statement was brief and heartfelt. I am guilty of a terrible crime, and I deserve to die for it. I pray that God will forgive me, and that Pearl Bryan's family can find some peace in knowing that justice has been served. At exactly 11:47 a.m., both traps were sprung simultaneously. Jackson died instantly, his neck broken cleanly by the fall. Walling's death was more prolonged, his lighter weight causing strangulation rather than the quick death that a broken neck provided. The crowd, which had been calling for blood throughout the morning, fell strangely silent as the reality of what they were witnessing finally sank in. The bodies were cut down after hanging for the requisite 20 minutes, examined by physicians, and pronounced dead. Jackson's remains were claimed by his family and transported back to New Jersey for burial. Walling's body was buried in the Newport Cemetery, his grave marked only by a simple stone bearing his name and the dates of his birth and death. But even in death, Scott Jackson managed to maintain one final secret. When pressed by ministers and investigators during his final hours about the location of Pearl Bryan's head, he had simply smiled and said, "Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved." With those words, he took to his grave the final piece of one of America's most notorious crimes, ensuring that Pearl Bryan's story would never be completely told and that his name would be forever linked to one of the most baffling unsolved mysteries in criminal history. The Headless mystery had claimed 2 more lives, but the questions it raised about justice, redemption, and the nature of evil would echo through the decades to come. The morning after the execution, as the crowds dispersed and Newport slowly returned to normalcy, few could have predicted that the Pearl Bryan case would fundamentally transform American criminal investigation. What had begun as a local murder had evolved into something far more significant, a watershed moment that ushered forensic science into the modern era and established precedents that would influence law enforcement for generations to come. Dr. Edward Score's pioneering use of dental records to identify Pearl Bryan's remains represented the first successful application of forensic odontology in American criminal justice. His meticulous documentation of the identification process, published in medical journals across the country, provided a template that law enforcement agencies quickly adopted. Within 5 years, dental identification had become standard practice in cases involving decomposed or mutilated remains, saving countless hours of investigation and bringing closure to families who might otherwise have never known their loved ones' fates. The case also marked a turning point in criminal profiling techniques. Detective Cal Crim's methodical analysis of the crime scene had revealed crucial insights about the perpetrator's background, education, and psychological makeup long before such approaches became formalized. His detailed notes about the surgical precision of the decapitation, the calculated nature of the body disposal, and the sophisticated attempts at concealing the victim's identity created a framework for understanding how educated criminals operated differently from their less sophisticated counterparts. Law enforcement agencies across the nation began to recognize that the changing nature of American society required new investigative approaches. The traditional methods that had worked in small, close-knit communities were inadequate for addressing crimes that cross state lines and involved perpetrators with professional training and social standing. The Pearl Bryan case demonstrated that respectability could mask the most heinous criminal behavior, forcing investigators to look beyond surface appearances when evaluating suspects. The legal ramifications of the case extended far beyond the immediate convictions. The prosecution's successful use of circumstantial evidence, scientific testimony, and psychological analysis established new standards for criminal trials. Commonwealth attorney William Hendrick's methodical presentation of the evidence became a model for complex cases involving multiple jurisdictions and extensive physical evidence. Law schools across the country began incorporating the Pearl Bryan case into their curricula as an example of thorough prosecution technique. But perhaps the most profound impact lay in the realm of public consciousness. The extensive newspaper coverage of the case had introduced ordinary Americans to the possibilities of modern forensic science, creating public expectations that would drive continued innovation in criminal investigation. Citizens who had once accepted that many crimes would remain unsolved now demanded that law enforcement use every available scientific tool to pursue justice. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of young women in an era of increasing social mobility. Pearl Bryan's tragic story resonated with families across the country who were sending their daughters to work in distant cities or allowing them greater independence than previous generations had enjoyed. The revelation that educated, seemingly respectable men could pose such dangers forced a national conversation about protecting women while preserving their newfound freedoms. Universities and medical colleges were compelled to implement stricter oversight of their students and laboratory materials. The ease with which Jackson had obtained deadly drugs and surgical instruments exposed significant security gaps in educational institutions. New protocols for tracking controlled substances and monitoring student access to dangerous materials became standard practice, helping prevent future criminals from exploiting their educational opportunities. The mystery of Pearl Bryan's missing head took on a life of its own, inspiring countless amateur investigators and treasure hunters. For decades after the execution, people continued searching for the missing remains, following up on tips, confessions, and rumors that periodically surfaced. The unsolved aspect of the case contributed to its enduring fascination, ensuring that each new generation would rediscover and re-examine the evidence. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. The case influenced popular culture in ways that extended far beyond true crime enthusiasts. Authors, playwrights, and eventually filmmakers would draw inspiration from the Pearl Bryan story, creating fictional works that explored themes of trust, betrayal, and the dangerous allure of educated psychopaths. The archetype of the charming killer with professional credentials became a staple of American crime fiction, influencing how society understood and portrayed criminal behavior. Modern forensic scientists continue to cite the Pearl Bryan case as a foundational moment in their field. The systematic approach that Dr. Score and Detective Krim brought to the investigation established principles of evidence collection, documentation, and analysis that remain relevant today. Crime scene photography, detailed witness interviews, and the methodical cataloging of physical evidence all traces their lineage back to techniques pioneered during this investigation. The case also demonstrated the importance of interagency cooperation in complex criminal investigations. The collaboration between Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana law enforcement agencies provided a model for future multi-jurisdictional cases. The sharing of information, resources, and expertise across state lines became standard practice, helping to ensure that criminals could not escape justice simply by crossing political boundaries. Perhaps most significantly, the Pearl Bryan case marked the beginning of the end for the era when criminals could assume that their educated backgrounds would protect them from serious investigation. The thorough exposure of Jackson's manipulation, his calculated planning, and his complete lack of genuine remorse helped law enforcement understand that intelligence and education could make criminals more dangerous, not less so. Today, more than 125 years after Pearl Bryan's brutal murder, her case continues to influence how we investigate crimes, prosecute criminals, and protect potential victims. The forensic techniques pioneered during her investigation have evolved into sophisticated sciences that can extract evidence from the smallest traces of biological material. The psychological insights gained from studying Jackson's behavior have contributed to our understanding of narcissistic personality disorders and the psychology of manipulation. Pearl Bryan herself, the young woman whose dreams of adventure led to such a tragic end, became more than just a victim. She became a symbol of the need for constant vigilance in protecting the innocent from those who would exploit their trust. Her story reminds us that evil often wears a familiar face, speaks in educated tones, and hides behind credentials and respectability. The Headless mystery that captivated a nation ultimately proved that no secret, no matter how carefully guarded, can remain hidden forever when science, determination, and justice work together. Though Pearl's head was never found, her legacy lives on in every case solved through forensic science, every victim identified through dental records, and every dangerous criminal caught through careful investigation and prosecution.